Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now, back when The Witcher 3 launched in 2015, its minimum system requirements were considered to be quite steep. An i5 2500K or Phenom X4 and GTX 660 or 7870 weren't exactly entry level, though the game certainly ran with lesser hardware. Furthermore, the performance with weaker than stated CPUs and GPUs only got better as time passed, and more updates for the game got released. It's not often that we see a developer update the minimum or recommended system requirements of a game after launch to reflect any changes or performance upgrades, and unfortunately The Witcher 3 is no exception, but I know for sure that the game is far more accessible to those with entry-level parts these days. Some would even consider the once pretty expensive i5 and 7870 entry-level in 2021, and I guess that's not exactly an unfair assumption to make. So how does The Witcher 3 run on two of the minimum stated parts, namely the aforementioned 2500K and 7870? We're running the i5 at stock as well as the GPU. The i5 has 4 cores and 4 threads, and the 7870 has 2GB of VRAM. In a previous video dedicated to the HD 7870, we discovered that the card is now best suited to lower resolutions with modern titles, but for games that are a few years old, well, it does a decent job. Let's get into The Witcher 3 then and start at the first village you'll encounter, White Orchard. What I'm going to do in this video is talk about how high you can turn the settings up and still retain 30 FPS, and then do the same for 60 FPS. So let's target 30 FPS here first of all. We're using the latest 21.2.3 AMD drivers, the Steam version of the game, and I'm recording using an external capture device to ensure that there is no performance impact outside of the natural hardware limitations. So with these so-called minimum specs including 6GB of system RAM, I was able to make use of the high graphical preset with Hairworks off, and a few other personal preferences changed under the post-processing medium preset, including switching motion blur and blur off. Ultra settings is a bit much for this hardware, producing around 24 to 25 FPS on average, which is still higher than I thought it would be, but not really all that playable once you account for the frame dips that occur. These are my suggested 30 FPS plus settings. You may be able to turn the odd setting up a little bit more, but I've tried to account for the frame time issues here. It's also worth mentioning that there are less dips with 8 gigs of RAM, which I briefly tested, and it's likely that you'll have a multiple of 4 in your system anyway. 6 gigs of RAM isn't really a common amount these days, but that's what was stated on the minimum specs, so that's what I used. It is fine though. Now you may be thinking that busy city areas like Novigrad will severely impact this frame rate, but I have more pleasant news. Bear in mind we are still working with a 30 FPS target in mind for now. The average frame rate in and around Novigrad itself was only 2 frames less than it was in White Orchard, although the 1% low was about 6 or 7 FPS lower. The 0.1% low was improved. In terms of real-world gameplay, this translates to a pretty stable experience for the most part. The moments where I noticed dips were when I picked a fight with a guard, and one other time when I was running toward the city centre and some fire smoke textures popped in. You may have also noticed that the CPU and RAM usage is slightly increased as well, which is to be expected, and this is where the 8GB of RAM would probably help us out. So I'm sure that there will be other locations in the game that cause bigger frame dips and some that will perform better, but so far the i5 and 7870 along with the 6 gigs of RAM seem to be doing a decent job with The Witcher 3 in 2021, especially with a 1080p 30fps target in mind. But what if you want 60 FPS? Well, the only way that we can get close to a 60 FPS average at 1080p is with the low settings, and I mean everything on the lowest too, both graphics and post-processing options. Despite these sacrifices, there are still going to be some similar drops to the mid-30s that we saw with the high settings earlier on, so my advice with The Witcher 3, if you have the minimum specs in your system, would be to make use of higher quality visuals with a plus 30 FPS target in mind, because even with things on high, the experience is going to feel pretty good to play. If you absolutely must have a constant 60 FPS though and not just close to it, then unfortunately I've got a bit of bad news, because 60 FPS, although achievable, won't be consistently so even at 900p low or 720p low. These specs can't offer a locked 60 FPS experience no matter the setting, which is again why I'd recommend tweaking the high settings at 1080p and enjoying the game as a visually impressive 30 to 40 FPS title as opposed to a muddy looking blurry 40 to 70 FPS one. But there we go, The Witcher 3 with the minimum system requirements in 2021 runs quite well if you don't mind a 30 to 40 FPS average most of the time. And to me this feels more than playable. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like on it down below, leave a dislike if you didn't. Let me know how The Witcher 3 runs on your system and the specs of that system of course. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.